Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some books and series with endings that I ultimately didn't really love. The first few that I'm going to start with are ones where the ending didn't necessarily ruin the series for me. It's not like I immediately wanted to throw my books in a fire or something, or more politely, take them into my local bookstore. But they were ultimately not as monumental, satisfying, explosive as maybe I was hoping for. And then the last few are the ones where I know that we've all experienced this before. You feel so betrayed, and you just feel like how could the author have done this? Why would anybody think that was a good way to wrap this up? They stink. You wish that the author would have scrapped it and started fresh. And if they're needing to be fresh and if they stink, then they definitely could use help from today's sponsor, Native. Native's body wash will very much do the trick with these book endings, as they have a variety of fresh scents and they use clean and simple ingredients while still having a really luxurious feel. So it'll leave your skin feeling soft and hydrated, it's residue free, and it smells amazing. I've actually been using the lilac and white tea body wash for the last year or two, but in working with Native today, I got to pick out some additional scents. I chose the coastal oak and amber, lavender and rose, and the sandalwood and shea butter scents. The coastal oak and amber is a little bit more of an outdoorsy and fresh scent. The lavender and rose is more of a deep, relaxing floral scent. And then the sandalwood and shea butter is somehow both clean and fresh and a hint heavy and woodsy. And it actually kind of reminds me of my mom a little bit. So I have this sort of nostalgic, cozy feel whenever I smell that particular one. But I honestly love all of them. I think the coastal oak and amber and the sandalwood and shea butter scents for me are more everyday scents, whereas the lavender and rose is sort of a nighttime shower or bath scent when I need to decompress from all the emotions these book endings made me feel. There are so many other scents to choose from though, so there's something for everyone, and the best part is that the ingredients are clean, simple, vegan, and cruelty-free. Native also has deodorants, hand lotions, and body lotions, so that if you, like me, need some self-care from what bad book endings do to you, you can treat yourself to any of these and or their limited edition scents. You can use the code Elliot2 to get 20% off your first purchase at Native. The offer is available site-wide, but only for a limited time, so stock up and save. The first few, again, they're not the ones that ultimately needed to be completely cleansed. They're just ones where I was a little disappointed by the ending. And I'm going to start with the Queens of Wrenthia series, the third book in the trilogy being The Queen of Sorrow. This is one where the third book felt a little bit like it didn't have the full attention on its story. And I actually do wonder, because there is a book that is essentially a continuation and I haven't picked it up yet, but it definitely felt like we were setting up for something else. And that's always tricky because there are other books that have done that very same thing. I think the third book in the Shades of Magic series is one where it also feels like there's so much that is open-ended and there's so many plot threads where you're questioning why they're there, because they seem like they're absolutely not going to get wrapped up in the book, and then they don't get wrapped up and you're left wondering why. And I definitely think that this had a hint of that, but this one also had a certain development. It very much felt like we were leading to something really big, and it felt like there'd been clues all throughout the series and we were finally going to get some answers. And then to some degree it was kind of like a JK sort of feeling, and nothing really came of certain things. And I'm trying not to say too much, of course, because I don't want to spoil it, but it just, the direction it went in, it very much almost had this oopsies. That's actually not the case. And I get that it almost subverted expectations to the extreme where I almost respected it, because a lot of times in series, especially the ends of series, you'll have this build-up and then you expect, oh, here's where it all finally comes to fruition. Here's where we finally get to see what all that was for. And then when it doesn't, it is unique. It is a decision that author made. I just didn't necessarily come away from it very pleased. Still, ultimately though, Queens of Wrenthia is one of the coolest worlds. I've mentioned that series quite a few times. Has a really awesome forest setting, and the way the characters navigate through the forest and how they have to use magic and work together to try and keep themselves safe and their society safe from these spirits that are in the forest that can wipe out entire villages. I think that the setting is unlike most I've ever seen, and it feels very well realized. So I really, really like the setting. I also think the shift in characters throughout the trilogy is interesting, and that you do kind of always stay with certain characters, but who gets the most spotlight is tweaked as you go. So by the end, it's kind of all of these perspectives, and they're pretty short books, and it is only a trilogy, but I really did feel like I got to know the characters throughout. So anyway, it is still a trilogy that I would definitely recommend. I do recommend it all the time. I just didn't love that ending, and I'm curious if you've read that trilogy, what were your thoughts on that ending? This next one, I almost feel like it doesn't belong on this list, but that feeling of disappointment, it's so intentional. The author is trying to evoke that in you, and he does it very successfully, and that would be the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This book, The Last Argument of Kings, I got to the end, and I very much had that feeling of, well, what was the point? And that is the point. The point is, what is the point? The grim, dark tone and themes that Joe Abercrombie captures, I definitely think are sort of setting the scene for a lot of other grimdark. That sense of bleakness, of outlook, of even when you try to change, even when your characters start out morally gray or just almost villainous in nature and you're starting to see growth, it doesn't even matter. Doesn't matter for them individually, doesn't matter for society as a whole. Not really. They're just one person, or in this case, it's just 4 people, we'll say, because there's about 4 main perspectives. And so it's frustrating because, you know, we like the here comes the cavalry type of tropes in our stories. We like the big battles where the heroes win and maybe they take some losses. And then there's the occasional book that comes along where maybe the bad guy wins, but usually it's good guys win, but there's varying levels of sacrifice along the way. And in this, it's like, it's kind of none of that. It kind of just ends and things are left where they're left and the powerful stay powerful and most people don't really change. So it is disappointing, but not in a bad way. It's an intentional, but it's still created that feeling of, really? In me. And it's kind of what I was saying about the other one. Do I respect it? I mean, I do, but also it's frustrating. Next up, we have The Folk of the Air Trilogy by Holly Black, that last book being The Queen of Nothing. This is one of those stories where I think a lot of people were a little underwhelmed by the ending, and I think that word just perfectly describes this. It's not so much disappointment. It's not that I came away from it really upset or anything. I was just kind of like, oh, I thought there would be more. And I think I especially felt this way because I went into this trilogy not with low expectations necessarily, but so many people had hyped it up, and I kind of went in telling myself, it's really hyped, so just try not to buy into the hype and try really hard to go into this just for what it is. And the first book I thought was enjoyable, but I didn't think it was necessarily as amazing and twisted as a lot of other people did. It was one where I was like, okay, I'll keep going because it's engaging, and I do like the world. I like the way Holly Black describes things, and I also think that I liked the wickedness of the Fae, and that played very well into the second book, The Wicked King, which surpassed my expectations. I really liked the scheming. I really liked the way in which Holly Black took advantage of the idea of Fae not being able to lie, so then how do they tell you something true that makes you believe something different? And then also our main character just trying to navigate as a mortal among all of these Fae. How is she going to try and have agency and power when they have so much? So the second book ended with just such a great ending where I was like, oh my gosh, I want that third book. I can't wait for that third book. And then we got the third book, and my expectations were then really high because that second book really set the bar. And then this third book kind of went back down to just being like, oh, okay, yeah, that was fine. And I think because my expectations had been lifted so much that I ended up liking this one the least. I also do think it is perhaps the weakest in the trilogy, and I think some things resolved maybe a little easier than I would have liked. I wouldn't have wanted forced conflict. I guess I just would have liked the conflict to have almost been elaborated on a little bit more, or for there to have been more of that trickery and wickedness that we saw in that middle book. But alas, we didn't quite get that, so it was kind of, the series was going up exponentially for me, and then it just kind of teetered back down. This will be the last one before I get into my rage-inducing ones. So this last one would be the Arrows Trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. It's less that the third book was frustrating in its conclusion, and more so that I think that the first book was so beautiful and lovely and cozy, and then the second and third books, they didn't quite hit at that level. There is a line in the third book, though, pretty much at the very end of the book, that it did not discredit everything else that had been said in the story. It didn't discredit the other themes throughout the rest of the story. I also want to add that this was written in the 80s, and I actually think it's very ahead of its time, and also ahead of some even modern fantasy that we get. So I don't think that this particular line at the end ruined all of that, but it was one of those moments where you're like, nah, no. And I actually buddy read this with some friends, and we did a chat for the whole trilogy over on my Patreon, and all of us were kind of like, yeah, that line, no, that's nope, not cool, no. And we all had that general feeling, but it really, to a point where I really was so hyper focused on that line. When I finished reading the trilogy and I went to bed that night, I was just laying there. I don't know if you all do this, where when you go to sleep, you end up thinking about all of your life choices and all the embarrassing things that have ever happened and all the books you've read, and your mind suddenly seems to work more instead of less. So that happens to me when I'm going to sleep, and I kept thinking about this line, and I kept being like, how can I pretend that that line isn't there? And at the end of the day, I did have to come to terms with the fact that it did exist and it was there, and I didn't like it, and I was like, okay, I can just confidently say I didn't like that line, but I still loved the first book. And what I was already saying before, there's so many wonderful themes throughout this story. I still like the world. I still am interested in what's going to happen in the rest of this world, so I will keep going with Valdemar. However, it didn't necessarily build from that wonderful, wonderful foundation that was book one. Now getting into some that really, I did not like the endings of these books whatsoever. The first one of these three would be The Wicked Deep. I actually kind of enjoyed The Wicked Deep. It's been a few years since I read it, so I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics, but it was a standalone that follows this coastal town in the US where there's this lore, this legend of these three women who were killed years before, and those women, a certain part of the year, will, almost like a siren call, they'll beckon young men to the sea, and then when these young men die, that ends this particular cycle of the year, and this happens every single year. And we see the way that our main character, it very much seems like this is actually happening. It does take place in modern day, and so you're trying to figure out, is this real? Is this some kind of prank? Is this just some kind of small town story that everybody buys into? And so you're following this character throughout, and there's a boy that she knows, and she's starting to think that this, almost like I said, siren call is calling to him, and she wants to protect him. I liked the story overall. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fairly creepy. I was intrigued. Got to the end, and I was like, oh, cool. I liked that book. And I read the epilogue, and I thought, why? Why did you do that? Why did you do that? I tried to tell myself that the epilogue just didn't exist. But alas, unlike with Arrows of the Queen, I couldn't come to terms with it. I was like, it does exist, and I don't like it, and it kind of ruins the whole book for me. And then I turned it in. I don't have it anymore. I really didn't like the ending of that book. Next, we have Iron Gold. I don't own Iron Gold, so I'm just going to hold up the third book in the original trilogy. But I have said many a time, I am skeptical about series continuations. Once you wrap something up, I have closed the door on that story. I don't want you to reopen it. I don't want you changing characters and their behavior, their personalities. I don't want anything changed. I don't want anybody to die in a continuation, because I'm like, no. Wherever things ended is where they ended, and don't start a new series and start that series with, oh, that main character who got there happily ever after, just kidding, they died 2 years later, or anything like that. I don't like it. I don't like when continuations change certain magical components to the story, like the rules and limitations feel like suddenly they've shifted for this new thing. So I'm very picky. It's not that it can't be done, because sometimes it can be and it's exceptional. This was not the case for me. I did not like, and I'm in the minority. I feel like no one agrees with me, and that's fine. But in Iron Gold, I really just, it took a certain character And I can just hear my friend Leanna, because we had a whole conversation about it back when we read it, and I just hear her disagreements, and it's fine, Leanna. But I feel like it took a character whose principles were what drove them, and yes, they were flawed, and yes, they made mistakes, but ultimately they held to a certain principle, and I feel like that principle was gone in Iron Gold. And I was frustrated by that, but I was like, okay, if I just accept that this is where this character is this many years after the end of the first trilogy, and this is what power does to a person, this is how the trauma of what they've gone through and violence has changed them, okay, I can accept that. And so I was reading, and I had accepted it, and then I was starting to actually be on board, and then the very, very end, I was like, are you kidding? How big of an idiot are you? And I was so mad at the end, and I was like, no. I already was like, this is a hard sell for me, and you got me to read it, and I wasn't liking it, and then eventually I got on board, and then it felt like you betrayed me with that ending, and I need to stop punching this book. But I do not like Iron Gold, and I've heard great things about the rest of the series, and I do not care. I do not care. It was so much of a disappointment for me, and it's funny because I actually think it was better written than the original trilogy, at least from what I remember. But I really questioned if I even wanted to keep the original trilogy, and unlike the Wicked Deep's epilogue, I was able to just say, you know what, it is a continuation, and this is the original story, and it can stay the original story for me. Now the last one. I don't think I need to elaborate all that much, because I read this last year, and you heard all about it plenty of times, but the Liveship Traders. I can't remember the last time I loved a book one in a series so much and hated the end of a series as much as I did for this one. And those are not short books. They are not fast-paced where they're page turners. I was gripped because of the characters. I was so invested in the characters. And I also felt like watching them either descend or become better, but then be beaten down, and just watching the little ways in which they developed throughout the story was an experience. It was done so well. They felt so real. And then the ending. So there's a certain moment in book 3 that not very many people like, because of the shift in perspective that you get right after a horrifying event where you're like, I don't know that I need to be in this person's head after they just did what they did, and I certainly don't want to hear them think about how wonderful it was to do this horrible thing to another person. But Robin Hobb does examine the reality of cycles of violence and trauma and what it does to a person, and she very much looks at what it does and how it creates a certain thought process and how a certain person will justify their actions. So I want to be clear that I don't think it was poorly written, and I by no means think it shouldn't have been written. Not at all. It's just that, like, everything that happened after that, I was so frustrated because this horrible person does this horrible thing, and I'm like, can some dragon squish them and burn them to death, or can someone throw them out at sea and let the mythical beings in the water eat them, or can the ship, like, crush him? Can somebody do something about this, please? And then the way everything unfolds, I hated every single thing, and I think that the themes that Robin Hobb was going for in Liveship, and with all the things that happen in the third book, I respect what I believe that she was trying to accomplish. I just hated how it was executed. So I felt so strange for a while, because I really did have to ask myself, do I actually feel this way because I'm so attached to these characters and the skill of the author has made me really care for them, and therefore I am upset when something bad happens, or am I upset at how these themes were executed? And ultimately it came to that one. I was angry for so long, to a point where I didn't even want to talk about the series. I thought about doing a trilogy review. I was in a live show on Booked and Busy's channel. Erin, I'll have her linked in the description bar. And I almost was like, I don't even know if I want to be in this chat, because I think I was probably rather subdued compared to my usual chatty nature when I'm in discussion videos. I just the whole time was like, and we did talk about that ending, and for the rest of the people in the chat, the ending did not ruin the series for them. It didn't ruin the book for them. They gave it 5 stars, and I was like, I can't get over how angry it makes me. It makes me really angry. So I'm going to stop repeating myself over and over again, and I would love to know, for any of the books that I mentioned, what were your thoughts on the endings? Do you feel similarly? Do you feel very, very differently? But also, what are some books or series that had endings that you absolutely loathed? Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.